The following 4 parts of this series are an adaptation of Doug Stanton's Horse Soldiers, a #1 New York Times bestseller. Paraphrasing of the published work is used with credit to the author. Some of the names in this story are pseudonyms to protect the identity of those involved. The comments and reactions displayed in this podcast do not reflect the opinions or views of the author. That's good. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the History on the Rocks podcast. This is your host, Cody, and of course, joining me, my lovely wife, Audrey.
Hello, everybody.
Ooh, well, here we are. The finale, part 4 of Horse Soldiers. This episode is called The Fortress. What are we drinking tonight?
Again, had a few glasses of wine at a family party, so not drinking Horse Soldier again tonight.
Yes, but we're still promoting Horse Soldier throughout this whole series, even though we're not technically drinking it tonight.
No.
But we are unofficially sponsoring them. We are not getting paid by them or anything, but we just wanted to put the whiskey out there with the book because they go hand in hand.
And it's very good. But tonight I am having a Blue Moon again.
Yeah, that's a good one. Can't go wrong with Blue Moon. I am drinking Coors Banquet again.
Nice.
It's I don't know. I'm just not in the mood for whiskey as we record this later at night. Beer is just better right now. Where we left off with part 3, we were talking about how the teams got through the gap in a ambush of rocket fire. They made it to the gates, the city of Mazar. And they also had a mishap at the school, the Sultan Razia school debacle, with both teams coming in and trying to handle the situation and not knowing the other ones were there. Yeah, that communication component was lacking. There was a communication breakdown there in which almost cost some lives. Definitely cost some Afghani lives, the Northern Alliance soldiers, with the miscommunication of Atta's men being in that schoolhouse, and then the team working with Dostum calling in airstrikes and blowing that building to bits. Our cliffhanger where we left you, where we're going to start part 4, is that Dostum had just made this deal with one of the commanders of the Taliban, and they were sending 600 men over to surrender. And again, that cliffhanger, one American is dead in the fortress after an ambush, and there is a long fight to take control of Qala-I-Jangi. So that is where we are starting today with part 4.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and just a reminder, Audrey has no idea what's going on.
I am with the listeners here.
She is with the listeners. I'm the only one who knows what's going to happen in part 4 here, obviously, because I'm writing it, and I've read the whole book. We haven't watched the movie yet. Audrey hasn't read any of these scripts as we've gone through these 4 parts. So, it's about to get a little crazy.
I know. I'm looking forward to the ending of this story and to watch the movie and listen to the interview with the author.
Yeah. That's the fun part, because today we're dropping this episode on a Tuesday, which is different for us because we usually drop our episodes on Thursday mornings. But I'm not making you all wait until Thursday to hear part 4 because we have an exclusive interview with #1 New York Times bestselling author Doug Stanton of Horse Soldiers. So we're really excited about that. So we're going to be dropping that episode on Thursday as our regular episode for the week. So capping everything off in a very exciting way here with our 4-part series of Horse Soldiers. So let's get into part 4, because I know you're all just chomping at the bit to know what's going to happen here.
Yeah.
All right. So the city of Mazar has this eerie feeling to it. The special forces noticed that the citizens were acting nervous and were on alert. 600 of those Taliban had walked and driven the 2 hours from Kunduz and were just outside the city limits, a completely unexpected return. 6 large trucks sat running on the highway. Many of these men were foreign Taliban who Faisal had tricked into returning to Mazar for safe passage to Herat. We talked about that in part 3. Dean Nasrallah was fast asleep when at 3 a.m., one of his team members came bursting in, startling him awake. Dean noticed Atta's light was on in his office, which was very unusual for this, mid-morning. Dean got dressed and hurried over to see Atta. Dean entered the office and Atta unrolled his map across the table. Atta read Dean's face, which was concerned, and had that, what's wrong kind of look, when someone... And remember, these two don't speak the same language, so a lot of things in these conversations are, very simple words or hand gestures, facial expressions, and Dean's just like, what's going on? So Dean's got this look on his face. Atta's like, Taliban and Al-Qaeda. That's what he says. Taliban and Al-Qaeda. That's all he says to him. And he starts pointing at Kunduz and dragging his finger over towards Mazar on the map. And Dean's like, here? Are you shitting me? They're back? We just drove them out of the city and they're already back? And Dean realizes now that the team's worst nightmare has come true. You've driven these Taliban forces all the way back to Kunduz. You figure that they're there, that they're going to be, trapped in Kunduz, and you can push into that city. But now they're coming back, and Dean's like, "Oh, are they retaliating already? This is happening very fast." It then came in over the wire to CIA officer Garth Rogers that the Taliban were congregated out by the airfield and wished to surrender. The Northern Alliance had already known the Taliban were going to show up, which is why they were scared and nervous. Because remember, Dostum made this deal. The Americans were left out of the loop pertaining to this knowledge. There was fear in the eyes of the young Northern Alliance soldiers, and this is when First Sergeant Dave Betts realized there was something extremely wrong with the way that this war was going. Back at Atta's safe house, Dean woke up Mark House and told him to get dressed. There was Taliban outside the city. Sergeant First Class James Gold, driving with Dean by his side, was following Atta's convoy out to the surrender site. They stopped on the side of the highway to get a look of the surrendering men from about a mile away. Dean, looking through his binoculars, thought, shit, that's a lot of bad guys. As he observes these men amongst the Taliban, he noticed multiple ethnicities and immediately knows that there's foreign Taliban and Al-Qaeda mixed into this group. So it's not just Afghan Taliban coming to surrender. There are foreign Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We've been talking about this whole series. These are the men who will fight to the death.
Al-Qaeda.
Yes.
Foreign Al-Qaeda.
Foreign Taliban and Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda's mixed in here.
Yeah.
Atta sent one of his men over to the surrendering Taliban to discuss the situation. When the man returned, he told Atta that the men wanted to keep their guns, in which Atta denied their requests. He's like, no way. You guys are not keeping your guns during a surrender. As Atta told Dean this negotiation of surrender might take a while, Dean heard Colonel Bowers and Dostum talking over his radio. Dawson was on his way to the surrender site. Dean called up Stu Mansfield on the radio and told him he needed as many guys as possible to keep guns on these guys during the surrender. He also wanted Dostum to back off the situation. However, the radio was not working. So yeah, there's this communication breakdown again, just like back at the school. And so Dean's team, being part of Atta's crew, is like, why are these Taliban back and what the hell is happening? And Dostum, he's now approaching with his convoy to take control of this surrender because he's the one who made it with the Taliban. So Atta told Dean that the surrender will work, but takes time because the Taliban will not want to give themselves up that easily. Obviously, that makes them look kind of foolish. As Dostum approached, Dean noticed more people coming up behind him and his men. Dean has this oh shit moment, realizes who they were, and it's a big problem. It's our favorite people, the press. 100 reporters total followed Dostum to the surrender site. 100 reporters.
That is extreme.
From all parts of the world. In the book, I think it describes more about the ethnicities of the press, but we're talking European press. We're talking Middle Eastern press, from everywhere.
Yeah.
Dean and his men were now afraid of their identities being captured by cameras.
I feel like that's just not safe.
The press doesn't care about safety.
Which,
they care about the story.
I get that. Because I feel like we've seen kind of some of that with the beginning of Gaza, and I'm sure, I feel like I saw it more with, or not Gaza, but like the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. And I feel like I didn't see as much with like the Ukrainian and Russian war. I guess I probably wasn't paying as much attention on the news about that at the time, but yeah, it's just not safe.
The press is always just trying to get their story, and they are not. A lot of the times during these type of conflicts, they don't care about. It's not even their own safety. It's they don't care about national security, which boggles my mind, because if something leaks that the military doesn't want leaked by the press, that puts your soldiers at risk. That puts your whole objective at risk.
Yeah.
And the press just doesn't care. They're in it for the story and the money, and it's just fucking ridiculous.
Well, and that's like just not even war situations or fighting situations. It's
Right.
just in general.
Just in
The
general.
press just does not give a shit about anything but their story.
Right. We could go on a rant about that.
I'll
for a
say
while.
that they have a job and they're going to do their job, but
Yeah.
it's still just like your safety is at risk here.
Yeah.
But
100%.
I guess it's up to your own risk if you're if you're going to have this job.
Now, the two warlords are going to speak directly here. Otto wants to speak to Dostum, and he lets him know that the situation is under control. Now, Dean followed Otto down the hill to make sure there was not going to be a physical altercation between the two guys, or between the two warlords. Dean covered his face with his scarf and tried to stay as far back as possible, hoping his picture wasn't taken. Otto and Dostum, in conversation, kept gesturing like, I'm in charge.
Yeah.
No, I'm in charge.
No, it's me.
Yeah, no, me. Now remember, Dostum is the one who made this deal of surrender back at the fortress. Atta has no clue about the surrender. Again, just to reiterate that point.
Mm-hmm.
There's a B-52 bomber circling ahead, ready to drop bombs at a moment's notice. And Dean knew that this negotiation had to end with the Taliban giving up their weapons and anything else on their person that could harm them. After 2 hours, the surrender had been complete. The Taliban demanded they be held at the airport, which Dostum agreed to. If they tried to make a run for it, at least, they'd be gunned down before they would be able to get far enough to escape. Dean noticed as the Taliban were being vetted that the Northern Alliance soldiers weren't really searching them completely. Dean knew there was nothing he could do about it. This is their surrender. They're taking control of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
The Taliban were giving up their rifles, which were being piled into a truck, but what else did they have under their robes that weren't being searched? Smaller pistols, grenades, things like that, right?
Bombs.
Sure. Yeah, whatever. They're still wearing all these clothes and
And they're like always covered all the time.
exactly, and they're not doing a very good job searching them, so they could have anything on them. Now back at the safe house, Major Mark Mitchell was listening in on the negotiations from his radio and did not like the idea of holding these men at the airfield, but knew there wasn't a big enough prison to hold them all. All of a sudden, Dawson had changed his mind. Now the prisoners were going to be held within the walls of Qala-I-Jangi. Mitchell thought, no fucking way. He knew that the weapon caches of RPGs, rifles, grenades, and rockets were still in abundance at the fortress, and they had not finished destroying them yet. So, a weapon cache, basically at the fortress, underground, they have these containers, like a pods container, just full of weapons from the Taliban when they had control of the fortress. And what the special forces were doing, along with NA soldiers, they were trying to destroy all of this stuff so that it wouldn't fall back in the Taliban hands. But they hadn't completed yet destroying all of that stuff, and having 600 prisoners in the fortress with those weapon caches available to them could cause a lot of problems.
You'd be screwed.
Right. Now, the Americans had been eagerly waiting all morning to leave for Kunduz, but this negotiation had held them behind. At 3 p.m., they headed out directly from the surrender site. As Dean looked over at the surrendering Taliban, he noticed that these men didn't look defeated or even worried. In fact, when two trucks pulled up next to Brian Lyle and Mark House, they looked like men who were about to enter battle. This impression left a bad feeling among the Americans. They knew better that this was anything but an innocent surrender. Something else had to be going on. The plan at Kunduz was to convince the Taliban to surrender. So the Taliban that are in Kunduz, not the ones that have just surrendered. Don't want to confuse anyone with that. Atta and the Americans would create a perimeter about 12 miles outside the city center and receive prisoners from there, like in groups, pretty much. The Americans would call in airstrikes as needed to further convince the Taliban in the city to surrender or get blown to pieces. However, everyone was on edge now that the prisoners back in Mazar were being held at Qala-I-Jangi. If something went wrong, they would be way too far away to get back in time if help were needed. Now, back in Mazar at the safe house, Major Kurt Sontag saw the trucks of prisoners drive by. He had never seen prisoners still driving their own vehicles in a surrender. A Northern Alliance soldier was in the passenger seat with a gun to the driver's head. Sontag was puzzled as the truck stopped in front of the safe house, and he watched the men eyeball it as if they were remembering the layout and observing the entrances. Sontag was indifferent about where the prisoners would be held, knowing that Dostum and his men were responsible for them. He was still concerned that the truck had stopped outside the safe house and wondered if they were setting up an ambush. Now, this part reminded me, again, of 13 Hours.
Yes, I literally was just going to say that. I'm like, this is 13 Hours at the fortress when that one car comes up.
And they're getting coordinates.
They're like,
Yeah, they're getting coordinates to shoot mortars at them.
Yes, like something's not right here. I'm picturing the dark-haired guy with the mustache.
The dark-haired guy with the mustache.
Tonto.
It's
Tonto.
Tonto. Yeah, okay,
yes.
Tonto, yeah. Tonto's, he is the one who's like, I remember that now. So I don't fucking like the feeling of it. I love that guy. I love that guy in that movie. He plays that part phenomenally. This is exactly that same kind of situation as like, shit, they're marking our location for something.
Yeah.
Mark Mitchell was also weary of this situation. The prisoners were driving straight through Mazar, and he realized at any moment they could jump off the trucks and start to wreak havoc on the city again. Later that night, gunfire erupted near the safe house, and the men had no idea what the situation was about. Turns out, there was some animosity between Atta and Dostum's men. Then Mitchell learned that at the fortress, when the prisoners arrived, one of the men summoned over Dostum's lieutenants, pulled the pin on a grenade, and blew them both up. One of Dostum's men running a video camera captured the incident. As these events started to unfold, Mitchell felt that the city was, quote, spinning out of control, end quote. Back at the safe house, First Sergeant Dave Betts had issued the highest security alert of ThreatCon Delta, meaning everyone was on alert, guns at the ready. That following morning, prisoners were being led up from the fortress basement into the courtyard. They were brought up by ethnicity, Arabs, then Pakistanis, then Uzbeks. CIA officers Mike Spann and Dave Olson were to debrief these men in the hopes of finding out more about Osama bin Laden and his movements or location, as well as if Al-Qaeda had more attacks planned around the world. Now, the prisoners were yelling at the American men as they questioned them, most of them stating, quote, "We have come here to kill you," end quote. Mike Spann bent down and saw a prisoner who wouldn't look him in the eye, as if he was trying to hide himself from being recognized. The kid was wearing a British-style commando sweater and would not answer any of Spann's questions. Spann thought he might be a foreign terrorist with his defiant behaviors. The man had blonde hair, blue eyes. No way he was from the Middle East. Spann thought maybe a Russian, a Brit, but he knew this man could speak English. Olson and Spann continued to berate him with questions, but the man just stared at the ground, silent. He thought that if he talked, the other Taliban would shoot him. He was relieved that Spann and Olson moved on, and he kept quiet. The man was an American named John Walker Lind from California.
What?
I need to stop here for a second, because the story of John Walker Lind is told throughout this whole book, and I would not touch on it until this point, because fuck him.
Uh-oh. I'm nervous.
I will not give any recognition on this podcast to an American working with a terrorist organization. And the only reason I'm mentioning John Walker Lind in this part is because this situation of Mike Spann and Dave Olson questioning him is just the beginning of what's about to happen.
Okay.
Out of nowhere, a giant explosion shook the ground of the fortress. An Uzbeki prisoner had tried to throw a grenade from the basement up the stairs at one of the guards, but it bounced back at him. As the explosion rocked the ground, prisoners jumped up and overtook the guards. The courtyard broke out into a clusterfuck. That is not Doug's words. Those are my words.
There's no quotes around it.
I literally took like 2 pages of what Doug wrote and put it into one word, clusterfuck.
Mm-hmm.
Prisoners were screaming Allah Akbar, which means God is great, as they pulled weapons and grenades from their clothes and began to kill Dostum's men. Mike Spann ran for cover toward this pink house that is in the courtyard, where from there he could at least fire his weapons and wait for the firefight to be over. As Mike ran for safety, he was tackled to the ground by prisoners. As he felt feet and fists beating him, he grabbed one of his pistols and began to fire it rapidly at the attacking men. A prisoner came up, fired 2 shots, killing Mike Spann instantly.
Oh, no.
Dave Olson turned to observe what had caused the explosion. Dave was returning to Dostum's quarters in the fortress and was halfway across the courtyard when he saw Mike Spann fall under the attack from the prisoners. He noticed when he turned around all of his guards were dead, and he fired his pistol rapidly at the prisoners trying to attack him. When he looked up, he saw Dostum and Atta's men had moved up onto the walls of the fortress and now were firing at prisoners from above. One of Dostum's soldiers, still in the courtyard, helped Dave retreat to safety. Olson made it to the stairs of Dostum's headquarters in the north courtyard, where he was shocked to see a blond man standing in front of him. No, it was not John Walker Lind. His name, this blond man, was Arnim Stauth, a German reporter who was there to report on the Red Cross efforts in the city of Mazar. He had taken cover in the stairway after gunfire erupted. Now, Dave Olson knew his cover as a CIA operative was now blown. He asked Stauth if he could please use his phone. Olson went to call the safe house, but didn't have the number on hand, so instead, he dialed the U.S. Embassy in Uzbekistan, who patched him through to the U.S. Army Central Command in Tampa, Florida, who then forwarded his call to the safe house in Mazar. On the other end of the phone was a CIA operative, Garth Rogers. He couldn't believe their cover was blown and what had been occurring at the fortress. Mark Mitchell was hearing gunfire from around Mazar that morning, but was clueless as to where it may be coming from. U.S. Army Medical Surgeon Craig Doc McFarland returned to the safe house after touring Mazar's hospitals and observing their conditions and technology. He heard gunfire coming from the direction of Qala-I-Jangi and thought it was odd because he knew Dave Olson and Mike Spann had gone there earlier to question prisoners. He alerted Mitchell that it sounded like a full gunfight over at the fortress. Just then, Sontag got a call from K2 base in Uzbekistan. An officer on the line stated, quote, "We've got a report that there's, 2 Americans dead in Mazar," end quote. Now, Sontag thought this had to be a mistake. He hadn't heard anything about this. Now, Mitchell received a message that a visitor needed to see him. Just then, one of Dostum's local friends named Alam Razan came running into his office. He told Mitchell, quote, "There has been a terrible incident. You must come. I think Americans are dead. The prisoners have seized control of the fortress," end quote. Sontag entered the office and looked at Mitchell in disbelief. Mitchell stated he would take some men over to see what was going on. He thought maybe just a few disorderly prisoners were causing trouble, something like that. Down from the 5th floor of the safe house, Garth Rogers entered Mitchell's office looking very grim. Like, oh shit. I have some news and it's not good. He then told the men Mike Spann was either missing or dead, and things grew more serious. Sontag and Mitchell started to devise a plan, knowing that they had to be careful entering the area of the fortress. Their mission was to find Dave Olson and, most importantly, retrieve Mike Spann's body if he was killed. Now, they don't know that he's killed. Obviously, we know now, the listeners know, but we are back at the safe house, and a plan is being put in place as to how to deal with the situation. They had about 3 hours of sunlight left, and they needed to move fast. They loaded up in a Land Rover, and Mitchell punched the gas, cruising through the city of Mazar as Rogers rode in the passenger seat, calling out the obstacles. Dean, at the outskirts of Kunduz, had received word about the situation involving Mike Spann. He also had received a phone call from the safe house asking him if he had all of his men with him. The caller said he was just checking in and that the details weren't clear, but something was definitely happening back in Mazar. Dean and Brad Highland started to pack up their things and head back to Mazar. However, Colonel Bowers had directed them that they would be staying in Kunduz in fear of a similar situation happening with these prisoners. Dean warned Mitchell that he had guys in Mazar and did not want them getting killed in a misfire if bombs were dropped. So, again, finally starting to communicate, like, don't just drop bombs, guys. We need to know where everyone is before we start blowing stuff up.
For sure.
As Mitchell approached the fortress, he couldn't believe the scene. He saw RPG rockets combing the sky, rapid machine gun fire, and men yelling. A full-out battle was taking place. Prisoners had climbed to the top and fired down at the entrance, bullets hitting all around the Land Cruiser. The SUV was stopped next to a guard shack at the entrance where Mitchell ordered Stephen Bass, a Navy SEAL, and the rest of his SBS team, which stands for Special Boat Services, and some of these guys are Brits. Their job is to spot where the prisoners were shooting from. The team got to the top behind a mud wall and set up their machine guns on tripods. They began to fire into the courtyard, killing many prisoners. They noticed that the Northern Alliance soldiers who had shown up to assist were firing down into the fort in what we would call, quote, spraying and praying, end quote. Very inaccurately, just firing and wasting ammo hoping to hit something. Now another problem. Mortars were being fired from a horse stable, but Mitchell couldn't pinpoint exactly where the mortar fire was, but knew they had to take this out before anything could be done. Mitchell knew he only had 1 hour to find Dave Olson because Sontag had called in an aircraft to drop bombs at 4 p.m. Mitchell radioed his movements, stating he was making his way to Dostum's headquarters, being the last known position of Dave. Mitchell was creeping along one of the fortress walls when he ran into one of Dostum's subcommanders, who luckily had a radio that he was talking to Dave Olson on. Over the working radio, Mitchell heard Olson's voice come in and was definitely relieved. They now could talk with Dave and set out to find him in the fortress. The Taliban found the weapon caches in the underground containers. They now had more grenades, RPGs, mortars, and rockets in their possession as they controlled the south courtyard. The prisoners started to target Dostum's headquarters in the north courtyard and started to hit it with rockets. Mitchell and Rogers made it to the northwest parapet of the fort, which was about 6 stories high. With the help of one of Dostum's men, they climbed the side of the parapet with a piece of fabric. They had made it to the top, overlooking the fort's courtyards. Mitchell decided there was too heavy of gunfire to move any further, and radioed in an airstrike. There was an F-18 en route. Mitchell directed the men with him to get over the north wall once the bomb hit and use the explosion as cover.
How do they... I'm slightly confused. How do they, know who is, with them and not with them?
So, Dostum's men wear specific colors.
Okay.
They mostly wear, I think in the book it says, red.
Okay.
It's hard. It's hard to tell the difference between, again, who's on your side and who's not. But I think the main part here is by using context clues of observation. In this case of who's shooting at who. You know who the prisoners are because the Taliban mostly wears black.
Okay.
Some type of black turban or black, robe or something.
Mm-hmm.
And they dress differently.
Okay.
So there's no military uniforms here.
Yeah. That's what I'm picturing in my head, they are typically wearing some type of robe outfit.
And to your point of you saying, you're confused, how do you know who's on whose side? You don't in the moment, really. You have to just kind of trust the guy next to you that he's a Northern Alliance soldier and he's firing on these prisoners that are in the south courtyard. But again, that just shows the point of this as well. These wars in the Middle East, you don't know who's on your side and who's not. They're not They're not wearing camouflage uniforms. They're not flying the flags of, who they represent. You don't know who's on your team. So you have to do the best you can, I think, in this sense to observe the situation of, okay, who's shooting at who? Okay, these guys are on my side. They're shooting at the prisoners below. So
they're with me. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Just seems like a whole lot of chaos. Other question. What's a parapet?
A parapet is so on the castles,
Yeah.
the top walls.
Okay.
Those are parapet walls. You know, like how they have the squares?
Oh, yeah,
Those are
yeah.
parapets.
Oh, okay,
Yep.
okay. Yep, got that.
Yeah. So, like, same thing on a fortress, right? Like, this is it's a giant fortress, like, all around. Like, if you look at the satellite image,
Yeah.
right? It looks like a giant hexagon almost.
Yep.
Yeah, the parapet is the wall on the top. And so they get over that wall, and now they can see into the fort.
Yeah.
Because they're on that top kind of like catwalk. You know what I'm talking about?
Yep. Makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that.
Anytime. The bomb was being dropped from the F-18 at 18,000 feet. Mitchell told Bach over the radio they were, quote, danger close, end quote, meaning they were in the area of the bomb strike location. Mitchell scoped in on the pink house in the middle of the south courtyard and assured it had the largest number of prisoners in and around it. He sent these coordinates to Bach, who relayed them to the pilot. The pilot dropped and it hit about 100 yards from the pink house. Mitchell called in for a more accurate second drop. The bomb hit the pink house dead on target. Many of the Taliban wanted to surrender, but were told by the foreign Taliban they would fight to the death. 3 more bombs were dropped, and Mitchell could not believe how ineffective they had been. The Taliban were still firing at a high rate and would not give up the fight. Mitchell ordered 1 more bomb, directed at the pink house again. After it hit, they jumped back out of the fort to the desert floor, stripped off their heavy vests, now only carrying their M4s, pistols, and radios. Mitchell spotted a window leading into Dostum's headquarters. They jumped in and started yelling for Dave Olson. Throughout the building, Afghan soldiers scattered, scared to death. One of them told the men Dave had made his escape and got down the back wall to safety, but Mitchell wouldn't trust this man's word until he saw Dave himself. Now again, Mitchell knew that darkness was coming. They had to get out of the area fast. As they drove back to the safe house, Mitchell heard over the radio that a QRF, which is a quick response force, of 24 men had just landed at the nearby airfield. So this is reinforcements for the Americans.
Yep.
Sontag had called them in during the airstrikes on the fortress when he couldn't reach Mitchell. He was fearing the worst. Around 6:30 p.m., Mitchell and his team made it back to the safe house, where he was elated to see Dave Olson walk down the steps. Mitchell and Sontag called an emergency meeting to review the events of the day and the plan going forward. They knew about 300 of the 600 Taliban were dead inside the fort, and Dostum's men were depleted or injured. Sontag put together what he thought the Taliban was trying to do. He came to this conclusion. The prisoners had rioted at Qala-I-Jangi, knowing the Americans in Mazar would respond. The city would then be unprotected to Taliban soldiers that were waiting north of the city. The Americans would then be attacked from behind and killed. Then the 2 Taliban groups from the fortress and the north would regroup and head back east to Kunduz to eliminate Nelson, Dean, Bowers, and the rest of the American teams, as they would be trapped between them and Kunduz. More bad news came from General Mohakek's Hazara soldiers. Now, we haven't talked about General Mohakek much in this, but he's the 3rd warlord that is a part of the Northern Alliance with Dostum and Atta. And his Hazara soldiers, they are an ethnic group. The Taliban to the north were ready to infiltrate Mazar. Mitchell ordered an AC-130 gunship to circle the Taliban in the north, and if they started to move on Mazar, take them out. And if you don't know what an AC-130 is, oh shit, is that big plane with giant cannons and guns on it that just goes boom, 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 and just destroys everything on the ground.
Yeah. Was not aware of what that is.
Yeah. The AC-130 is a badass piece of aircraft artillery, I'll tell you that. They continued to hear gunfire and explosions on the west side of Mazar near the fortress. They knew the city was unsafe now, but would not retreat. The Americans would not retreat the city. The next morning, November 26th, 2001, the safe house team returned to Qala-I-Jangi. Mitchell was laying on the fort's middle wall on the eastern edge. So if you're looking at the map, you can see exactly, like, I don't have it pinpointed, but if you go to the wall that splits the north and south courtyards, if you go to the east, he's right there on top of that wall. This position gave him the vantage point he needed to see the Taliban's activity in the southern courtyard. He watched as the Taliban fighters were launching mortars and firing their AKs at the northern walls of the fort.
Can I ask a question?
Mhm.
So, obviously, I can see it on the map, but in perspective, like, how large is this fort?
This fortress is huge. So if you go into the map, here, walk in the map with me. The fortress is about 300 meters in both directions, north and south, east and west. So it's pretty big.
My interpretation of it is like a mall
Yeah, it's pretty big.
without everything on the inside.
This is not a small place.
It's like the outside of a mall.
Yeah.
But it's big. Okay. I was just wondering. And wait, okay. Another question. So there's stuff underground?
Yes, there's an underground to the fortress.
Because I feel like there's not a whole lot above ground
Right. There's
space to go to.
Right, it's a courtyard. So like Dostum's headquarters is that northern point. It's like a building built into the fortress with the walls. Yes.
Yeah.
And then there's underground there's underground tunnels and spaces.
Okay.
Mitchell watched as the Taliban fighters were launching mortars and firing their AKs at the northern walls of the fort. 300 yards away from him, across the northern courtyard, were Captain Paul Syverson, Captain Kevin Leahy, Sergeant First Class Pete Bach, Air Force Combat Controller Malcolm Victors, and Sergeant First Class Dave Betts. Mortars were starting to fall all around the men. Pete Bach was radioing the F-18 pilot overhead to drop bombs before these Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters got out beyond the fortress walls. The F-18 pilot would not drop without coordinates. As more mortar fire landed no more than 50 feet away from them, Bach yelled into the mic, telling the pilot to hurry up and having him listen to the explosions around them. Syverson finally gave in and told Bach to give the pilot the coordinates. Now, they didn't want to give him the coordinates because they were afraid that if the pilot had them, he would target their location on accident. The pilot punched in the coordinates and the bomb dropped. Mitchell listened as the countdown came in over the radio. The bomb exploded, the floor shook, dead silence. Mitchell looked back to see the south courtyard and the mortar position hadn't been touched. Then Mitchell looked back and saw a large cloud of debris hanging over Syverson's position. The bomb flew through the parapet the men had been sitting on and dropped 20 feet down before exploding. Syverson flew through the air, kicking and flailing. Dave Betts was thrown 60 feet, hair singed off his face. Oakley's sunglasses melted, and as he turned to look at Pete Bach, he laughed in relief that he was alive. However, that really hurt as well.
Yeah.
Betts looked down and thought he had lost the lower half of his body.
Oh.
Luckily, he was just buried in pebbles and rubble from the blast. Now Kevin Leahy was groaning at the bottom of the fort wall, which collapsed inward. Mitchell could not get a hold of Syverson on the radio. Mitchell got a hold of the 10th Mountain soldiers who told him the bomb had hit the other men's position. Mitchell ordered everyone to regroup at the fort's entrance. Kevin Leahy had to be resuscitated several times. Syverson suffered a broken hip and back. However, besides the broken bones, burns, and cuts, they all had survived. Now, after all of this, all 5 men would receive the Purple Heart and Bronze Star and return to active duty in the future.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I don't know if this is luck. I don't know if this is fate. I don't know if this is destiny for all 5 of these guys. But a bomb hit you, and you all survived it.
And are able to go back in the future to active duty.
Fucking nuts. These guys are nuts in the most positive way possible.
Yeah.
They are nuts. Mitchell, under duress, called out for all U.S. aircraft to cease fire and head back to base. They were done for that morning. Mitchell needed to regroup everyone and make sure everyone would survive before he could move forward. He was worried about finding Mike Spann's body as well as completely destroying the fortress. Sontag and Mitchell would decide to hit the south courtyard of the fort with guns and cannons of an AC-130. They had to stop the Taliban as soon as possible. This would occur that night. However, the Northern Alliance were already moving in for a daylight assault, starting in the north courtyard and advancing into the south courtyard. That night, the NA retreated to the small village of Dadi to allow the AC-130 to come in and do its thing. The cannon fire hit the weapons cache, which was resupplying the Taliban, and launched a giant mushroom cloud into the sky. So like I said, AC-130, giant cannons on them, pummeled the fortress, penetrated the ground, hit the weapons cache underground, and destroyed all that stuff. The following morning, the NA went back at it in the south courtyard, making full entry. The Taliban were still fighting hard, but the Northern Alliance were fighting and winning. On November 28th, the fighting in the south courtyard was finally over, as Ali Sawar and his NA soldiers had captured it. Dostum had returned from Kunduz that morning to reclaim his fort. Dean, Nelson, and Bowers also returned, with Mullah Faisal, the Taliban commander, as their prisoner now. So that was the Taliban commander that Dostum made this surrender agreement with.
Yeah.
From Part 3. Soldiers and reporters walked the southern courtyard, surveying the damage of the previous days. Prisoners were trapped below in the basement of the Pink House that was destroyed. Some of them were still holding grenades, RPGs, and rockets. They could hear the voices of the men above, who believed they had killed everyone in the fight, especially below ground. Dostum turned to Faisal, asking, quote, "Did you know anything about this?" End quote. And the Taliban warlord just shook his head no.
Bullshit.
Fucking liar. The prisoners considered making one more attack, but before they could, NA soldiers started to throw grenades and rockets into the basement through the vents. Now, after an aid worker was shot going down the stairs to the basement, Dawson's men started to pour fuel into the basement, burning men alive. Still, they wouldn't surrender. Now, a small stream at the southwest corner of the fortress was redirected to flood the basement of the Pink House. The water was freezing, and the men underground took a vote. They finally would surrender. 4 days of trying to level the fortress, it was finally secured, and the Taliban were defeated. Mike Spann's body was retrieved and brought back to the safe house in Mazar. His body bag was draped in an American flag and flown back to K2 Air Base in Uzbekistan. CIA Director George Tenet publicly announced Mike Spann's death, stating, quote, "Mike was in the fortress of Mazar-e-Sharif, where the Taliban prisoners were being held and questioned. Although these captives had given themselves up, their pledge of surrender, like so many other pledges from the vicious group they represent, proved worthless. Mike was a career of promise and a life of energy and achievement, a precious life given to a noble cause." End quote. Doug writes about Mike's sacrifice in an honorable way, stating, quote, "The effect was that Mike Spann became an overnight hero, an accolade he would have shunned while he was alive. He became a figure of everything that a nation felt was honorable about itself, namely, selfless sacrifice while at war with a new and mystifying threat." End quote. The NA and the Americans were so close to losing the war in Afghanistan in a short month. They prevailed and became the first U.S. soldiers in the 20th century to be part of a cavalry attack. General Tommy Franks described the event as, quote, "It was as if warriors from the future had been transported to an earlier century." End quote. Their selfless sacrifice to our great nation should never be taken for granted. These men are the heroes America doesn't deserve, and the heroes that we should never forget. And that concludes our 4-part series on horse soldiers, the first Americans in Afghanistan after 9/11.
That was a good one.
It's a crazy story.
And like so unknown when I feel like it's so important being like the first ones there.
I think I don't know if I said this to Doug or if I am planning to say this to Doug in the interview. I think I said to him over the phone, like, I was almost embarrassed not to know this story, especially with how much I love military movies and stories and history and military, just and American military history especially, and just not knowing this and kind of like it slipped off my radar. I almost feel just embarrassed that I absolutely passed this up, and that's why I felt like this was such an important story to tell on this podcast.
Yeah.
And I know it's not like, it's recent history. I mean, this is in the past 25 years. But I think this is a story that I feel like not a lot of people have heard.
No. And even the fact that this became a movie with some pretty big names in it, and it was not something that we had seen or even that we haven't even heard of.
Yeah.
Or I mean, maybe you've heard of it. I have not heard of 12 Strong.
No, I mean, I really didn't know about the movie either. But when I'm thinking about this, I'm like, I think this story gets overshadowed now by like Zero Dark 30, the movie Zero Dark 30.
Killing Osama bin Laden.
Killing Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
Because that story is so mainstream and one of the biggest events in the world that this gets overlooked as this is where it started.
Yeah. This is the beginning of it all.
I mean, the movie Zero Dark 30 exists because horse soldiers started this. They were the first ones in and trying to gain intelligence on where the hell Osama bin Laden was and
working with the Northern Alliance.
Yeah, and trying to get Afghanistan back to them and move the Taliban out. And like, I don't know. It's just, I could, you know me, I could go on forever about this, especially in our recent presidency here, where we just let the Taliban take Afghanistan over, and all of these efforts of this story that we're talking about are almost in vain.
I know.
Like it's just, to me, it's pathetic. But
we're not making any political statements.
I'm trying not to make a political statement right now, but I think it's pathetic that we allowed the Taliban to reclaim control of Afghanistan after all this work that was put in by our military.
For sure.
Because we're not talking about politicians right now. We're talking about the military, our men and women who go overseas to try and make the world a better place because they believe in it. Yes. Not what our politicians want necessarily, because I could give a crap what our politicians want. But our men and women of our American Armed Services, they go into the military to make a difference.
Yeah.
They're in a political game, but their hearts are in the right place. Mm-hmm. And Afghanistan has just gone down the shitter again. The Taliban are back, and we left all of our weapons behind for them.
Mm-hmm.
And just pulled everyone out. And I think it's a travesty.
And here you go.
Yes. And it's a travesty to me as what has occurred in the Middle East, because it's going to continue to be a shit show of an area. And we did, and pulling out of Afghanistan and just reading this story just almost breaks my heart about how much progress was being made. And then all of a sudden, just like that, nothing.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that is the finale.
I'm glad so many of these men, no women were mentioned, but I'm sure among the years there were women over there as well. But in this story, these men, all but it sounds like one, made it home. Americans made it home.
Yes.
Alive.
And I mean, if we're talking about, I mean, there's no women highlighted in this story, obviously. However, again, Zero Dark 30, a woman in the CIA. She's the one who kept prying, and she's the one who found Osama bin Laden and took all these risks.
Yeah.
And she's a big part of that as well. And I don't know her name off the top of my head right now, but she's played by Jessica Chastain, right? Yeah.
Jessica Chastain.
Yeah, she's played by Jessica Chastain in the movie of Zero Dark 30, and there's so many people that go into this effort. It's not just one person. It's not a shot that was fired into Osama bin Laden's head. It's not. It's all the behind the scenes stuff.
There's so much that went into
people
it.
that work in intelligence and the military and all that make these things happen. So, I'm sure I can find another 1,000 stories of the last 25 years.
Thank you to all the men and women who serve our country. You are amazing and underappreciated, I feel like.
It's a thankless job.
Yes, we appreciate you more than you know.
Thursday, we are going to have our interview again with Doug Stanton, #1 New York Times best-selling author of Horse Soldiers. And I would highly recommend, even though you know the story from our podcast here, I would recommend going and buying the book and reading it from front cover to back cover, because there is so much more that we did not highlight in this podcast. I'm telling you, if you're interested in this type of reading, Doug does such a great job of putting you right in the story. You feel like you're right there next to these guys, walking through everything that they went through. Like, he just does a great job detailing and stuff like that. And we're going to talk more in the interview about that and how he was able to write like that, and the places that he saw in person and the stories he heard to be able to write this book. So I'm really excited to hear Doug on our podcast. I'm so pumped.
Yeah, that'll be really exciting.
And then next week, the following week, we will have Common Phrases Part 3.
Yay. A little comic relief.
After all of this, after a month of Horse Soldiers and this in-depth story, we're going to come back with some more common phrases for you in our third part of that throughout this season 1 of History on the Rocks podcast, and we're going to have some fun with some more idioms.
At first, I thought you were going to say, oh, we're going to take a week break.
No, we don't. We're not taking a break yet.
No.
We'll take a break in between seasons.
Yeah.
But
no,
that is not in the near future.
Common phrases will be good.
All right. Well, I hope everyone enjoys your midweek.
Early week.
Have a cocktail tonight. Relax.
Yeah.
You know, get ready for Thursday. In our
Turning
interview.
up on a Tuesday.
Taco Tuesday.
Taco Tuesday.
Go
Get a
margarita,
Go
some
get a
tequila,
margarita.
whatever. Relax. It's almost, summertime, and nice warm weather's coming. So,
woohoo!
we really hope you enjoyed this series of Horse Soldiers on History on the Rocks podcast. We will see you on Thursday with the interview with Doug Stanton, and we'll talk to you later.
See ya.
Cheers.